Hello, I'm Ed Needham, editor of the fabulous literary magazine Strong Words, and this is my podcast, The 5 Rules of Writing. In each episode, I speak to a most excellent writer in a particular genre about how they do it. And if you'd like to know more about Strong Words, and specifically how to subscribe, go to www.strong-words.co.uk and you'll be whisked straight to the website. Hello, and welcome to the 5 Rules of Writing, brought to you by Strong Words magazine. If you'd like to find out more and think you'd like to subscribe, take a look at the website. That's strong-words.co.uk. Don't forget the hyphen. This is a podcast where I talk to writers about the 5 things they know to be true in writing whatever it is that they write for a living. So whether they spend their days writing the history of ballet or multi-volume family sagas set in the heart of Africa, there are some aspects of their work that are absolutely non-negotiable. But today my guest is a journalist and author whose latest book, called A Furious Devotion, is a biography of the singer, songwriter and legendary hellraiser Shane MacGowan. Now, writing this book meant spending a lot of time in MacGowan's orbit and getting used to his idiosyncratic approach to such things as timekeeping and polite conversation. And even when staying at the singer's Dublin flat, he would sometimes get up in the morning to find MacGowan still in front of the television, having yet to make it to bed. He quotes producer Steve Lillywhite as describing MacGowan as one of the only 2 true bohemians he has ever known, the other being Keith Richard. If they wake up at 7 in the morning, he says, it's purely coincidence. Now, in this terrific book, you very soon get the sense that this is a person with a truly idiosyncratic and unpredictable approach to life. So here to talk about his 5 rules of writing about difficult individuals, I'd like to welcome Richard Balls. Richard, hello, how are you today?
Hi, Ed.
Now, what prompted you to take on such a challenging biography?
I asked myself that several times during the course of researching and writing about Shane. Essentially, I was a fan, so I saw the Pogues. I stumbled on them actually in 1984 when they were supporting Elvis Costello and the Attractions, and that was at the UEA in Norwich, and loved the band. I feel quite privileged to have actually seen them at a very early stage in their career, to seeing Shane in that sort of incarnation of the band, that very first run at it, really. Then I interviewed him for the book I did about Stiff Records, and that involved, spending quite a few hours with him in London at a bistro. Very, very interesting. I found him fascinating character, very different to in some ways to how I had expected, because as you said in your introduction, he has this kind of hell-raising image, but is actually quite a quiet man of very few words, and getting information out of him has to be done very, very delicately. Mm-hmm. He also, even just during the short period that I spent with him to talk about Stiff Records, he managed to lock himself in the toilet of the bistro, and we had to go and get staff to get the master key to get him out and all the rest of it. So that wasn't without incident. So then some years later, I felt that that he would be a good subject for my next book. And Paul Ronan, who is one of Shane's oldest friends, who facilitated that meeting in London, started taking me to Dublin to his flat to actually spend time with him.
And why did he decide that he was ready to have a biography written about him? It's often it's quite a difficult thing for a lot of people, isn't it? I mean, you get your sort of egomaniacs who can't wait to be written about, but even they, when they see themselves on paper, tend to have a rather uncomfortable reaction. What made Shane decide that he was ready to be written about?
In a sense, I think the answer to that is I'm not actually sure that he did decide that he was ready for that. Shane doesn't really kind of operate like that, and that's not really how his mind works. I think it was because he was reassured by Paul, who was a very old friend, And obviously Victoria would have sort of been involved in this as well.
That's his
And
wife, right?
which is Shane's wife, Victoria Clark, who was also incredibly helpful in the making of this book. So I think that they felt that this was somebody that, because I was going with Paul and I was spending time. Generally, most of the time I wasn't on my own with Shane. I was with Paul or Joey Cashman, who's another of Shane's very old friends, or the late Dave Lally. So there were other people around, and a lot of the conversations from which the interview material came were actually in conversations with a group of people, with 2 or 3 of us at night.
From Strong Words magazine, these are the 5 rules of writing. Okay, well, that leads us perfectly to your first rule, where you say don't attempt to, in quotes, interview them. Shane hates being interviewed, especially about his work. Better to chat casually and record stuff when there is a window of opportunity. So why does he hate being interviewed about his work?
He's actually a very shy, quite reserved person. He's definitely not an egomaniac who couldn't wait to have something written about him. Quite the opposite. Shane is quite modest. I mean, certainly over the years, there have been examples of kind of rock star behavior, that kind of spoiled behavior. Mm-hmm. But there's no sort of massive ego at play at all. I think he doesn't really like talking about his work. I think he finds that just quite uncomfortable. Really, when people have met him and say, "Oh, Shane, I just want to say I think you're the greatest." I think he finds that just very uncomfortable. He'd rather just have somebody pull up beside him and say, what do you think of the hurling or something, and have a drink with him. So I don't think he feels very comfortable about talking about his work particularly. He really hates that. Also, interviews generally for him over the years have meant being in a particular place at a given time. You have to meet this journalist at X time, at X venue. He doesn't like being told what to do at all. So over the years, if you look at a lot of Shane's interviews with the press, they've always started with, "I was meant to interview Shane at 8:00 at such and such in the event."
It's something that really comes out of the book is that he is unbelievably timetable phobic. I mean, have you ever met anybody who's kind of tougher to pin down or
no, I mean,
talking about themselves less?
Definitely not. I mean, I read one quote from somebody who I think it was a documentary maker who described writing about him or working with him as a sort of nature photography, like wildlife photography, that you can sort of spend 3 hours in the freezing cold waiting for a snow leopard, and eventually you get 3 seconds of footage and then it's over. Yes. It's literally, the windows of opportunity are very slim. I think the advantage I had was, I wasn't trying to interview him. I was sitting in his sitting room. He was watching television. No one was actually interrupting his. And that is quite a weird thing with Shane, for me at least. He watches television all day. He has his face to the television 24 hours a day, unless he's taken outside for some reason. And so you're never going to get his full attention, because a lot of that proportion of that attention is given over to the television, which is also incidentally on at top volume. And I remember saying to Joey, I think it was, or Dave, quietly, do you think he would, do you think we could turn the TV down? And they said to me, if you ask to turn the TV down, he will turn it up louder.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Will you explain this quite early on, in the book? The television absolutely blaring away. You very tentatively, nervously ask if you can turn it down, knowing that you could so easily break this very tenuous connection that you've got. I think he was talking about something which you really wanted to get on tape, but to ask to even touch the remote control was to flirt with being asked to leave Ireland. Were you constantly on eggshells with him?
Yeah, definitely. Not because he's particularly irascible, although he can be. But yes, I was on eggshells because, as you very brilliantly put, it's a tenuous connection, and when you do get onto something that he wants to talk about, and you think, great, okay. So he one of the things I noticed was because he doesn't like talking about his work, he and I couldn't get much about Pogue's tours and things like that from him for that reason. But he seemed much more keen to talk about his childhood. He loves telling stories about where he's the rebel, like, shoving nettles down a fellow pupil's pants or something. He loves telling stories like that, or how he was in trouble with the police, or how he went to court. Really happy to talk about all that stuff. And I found that, don't break that, as you said, don't break that connection. Once you've got him going, let him keep going. A couple of times he did get really cross out of absolutely nowhere. And you think, oh, God, just when I thought we were getting somewhere, suddenly it's broken. But actually, the thing with Shane is he forgets about it almost instantly. So a few seconds go past and you think, that's it, the connection's broken. It's like snakes and ladders. You feel like you've almost got to 99 and then you've gone straight down a snake again, back to square one. And then he suddenly goes, oh, let me tell you some more stories. And you think, oh, we're back to we're off again.
Okay. Was there anything that you'd kind of learnt in all your years of interviewing people that you were able to use to put him at ease?
Well, it's really difficult to say, because I think I was a journalist for 20 years working in news and covering a lot about crime, for example. So I have been in some quite delicate situations over the years and possibly dangerous situations. So a lot of the time, I think you actually take these skills for granted. I don't sort of go around thinking I've got these amazing interview skills.
Right.
But actually, when you talking to somebody like you, you actually start thinking, oh, actually, yes, these are skills. So I think one of the things that probably I did well at was because Paul Ronan, incidentally, Shane's old friend, was excellent here, because he advised me along the way, don't push it. You can't just walk into a room, say to Shane, great, I'm going to ask you about school today, blah, blah, blah. Apart from the fact that wouldn't work, it would actually set you backwards. He would be so annoyed that it would take a while then to recover. So I think one of the skills was not being pushy. As I used to sit there and it was so, I had to stop myself continually asking, because apart from anything else, I was on a stopwatch, because I live in Norwich in the UK. I don't live in Dublin, and I have a full-time job. So, I was sitting there thinking, look, I'm in. I've got to get it now.
Right.
But equally thinking, I can't get it now, this instant. I'm going to have to wait. So I think being patient was one of the big things.
Okay, that's good. I mean, I think, I always used to think, watching, say, the Michael Parkinson show in the 70s, what could be easier than interviewing people? You just ask the questions, right? And then sit back and let them talk. But actually, as soon as you start interviewing people, you realize it's not the asking the questions, it's a process of extracting information. And if people aren't prepared to externalize it, you ask as many questions as you like. So it's
I think that's
exasperating experience.
It is exasperating. That is the exact word. And I think the other thing is, because I was interviewing lots of other people, so I interviewed or got contributions from over 60 people for this book, and that included his dad, his sister, bandmates, other celebs, Sinead O'Connor, and for those interviews, without exception, they were more like a normal interview. I met the person in most cases. We sat down, we had a coffee, we had a drink. It was in a bar, and we recorded it, after some polite chat at the beginning, as we are today. So they were all completely normal kind of interviews. But with Shane, it's completely different. So often I was going from those interviews to him, and then having to go back to this different mode of approach completely. Right. And I spent a lot of time just sitting there. The first time I went to Ireland, I think I kind of said to myself at one point, don't try and interview him on this trip. Right. just actually write off this trip as an introductory phase. This is phase one, introduction to Shane.
Right.
And allow him to, apart from anything else, I was a guest in his home and in Victoria's home. Very generous of them to allow me to be there. So I think that first trip was like, don't interview him, don't ask anything, just let him think that I'm okay.
Right. Now that takes us very elegantly to your next rule, which sort of takes us to the next level of complexity with writing about difficult people, where you say, don't take what they say at face value and try to corroborate stories with other people who were there or can be relied on for the facts. So there's this idea that even if you do get them to say something, there's absolutely no knowing whether it's true or not. They could have made something up. It could be hopelessly misremembered. And there's always this problem when drink and stronger stimulants have been taken. Memories can fishtail across the road in even the most sober memories. So I imagine this is an absolute nightmare with a band like the Pogues and with Shane MacGowan.
Definitely. I mean, Shane drinks all day long, but that's not kind of gulping down drink in a kind of haphazard way. It's just a very, very gentle way of just sipping away at a glass of wine across the day. It's not the kind of hell raising that people might imagine from having read tabloid headlines over the years. He's also he can't move around at the minute, so he's restricted. So it's a very, very difficult process talking to somebody like that. And as you say, I mean, it's not taking what they say as gospel. I mean, the thing with Shane is myths have grown up around Shane's story like weeds over the years, to the point where it's actually impossible to see the original plant. I mean, all you can see is just this mass of weeds. And one of the things that I was hoping to do, although it might have perhaps been a bit of a fool's errand, really, was to try to separate the myth from the fact. For example, many people have believed that Shane was born in Ireland. And this may be because he has actually told people this himself. So documentaries, even BBC documentaries, have started by saying Shane was born on the banks of the River Shannon. No, born in Tunbridge Wells in Kent. Now, to me, Shane used to get very annoyed with me when he felt that I was trying to get at details. Why do you keep going on about details? But there are certain details which I think it is absolutely critical to get right. And where the country in which somebody is born, especially in his case, is absolutely critical to knowing the truth. So, getting to that, getting to where he spent his childhood, which is another thing which has been surrounded by myth over the years and people have got wrong all over the place. It's really, really important that Shane, to write that Shane grew up in England, because Pogue's lyrics were written through the sort of prism of being second generation Irish in England. That was the whole point. They could never have come from them. So those kind of facts are really important. And so the what I did with this book was I made extra sure that where I thought something was a bit dubious, that I would check it with Siobhan, his sister, his dad, his school teacher, so I would go back to those people and try to corroborate and try to get, and sometimes I think it's also important to say that at the end of the day, the book was about Shane, not those people. And that was something I also tried to keep hold of throughout the writing of it. This isn't about them. It's not about Sinead O'Connor. It's not about Siobhan. It's about Shane. So give him his voice. Let him say what he has to say. But actually, if there's something where it needs corroboration, then have the alternative voice, which says, actually, I think this.
Right. Well, that's actually another your next rule, isn't it? You say when writing about them, let them have their voice as much as possible, as the book is about them, and where appropriate, leave the reader to make their own mind up. Where with Shane did you find this most to be the case? Perhaps you wanted to push in a particular direction, but you just had to take your hands off a little bit.
Yeah, I think. I suppose where he's perhaps talking about his own addictions, his behaviour around drugs. The book has been very honest. And a lot of reviewers have commented on this, in fact, sort of unanimously about how honest it is, although it's a pretty much an authorized book. It is very honest about his behavior post sort of the late 90s. And I think that's an area where I was happy to get what Shane actually has to say about some of these incidents that took place, people dying in his flat, quite serious stuff, and get into his head and hear what he had to say about those things, and then let the readers decide what they thought about that behaviour, what they thought about the way certain episodes were dealt with.
And were you able to get him to reflect at all on his chaotic nature, or sort of where it came from, perhaps? Because even though you now paint this picture of him today as he's very much a quiet man. He chooses to get around by wheelchair, spends his life in front of the television. But in the past, obviously, stays in mental hospitals. He's sabotaged some great opportunities in his career. No one in music can have spent more time in A&E than Shane MacGowan. Did he ever speak on what he thought made him this sort of fireball of self-destruction?
I think probably no. I mean, I think that's something that's quite hard to get out of him. And Jerry O'Boyle, his sort of de facto manager, says that he lives in his head, and I think that's quite a good description of Shane. He doesn't really voice those kind of thoughts very easily. What he thinks about some of that stuff, I think he's pretty much kind of kept to himself, really. He talks about. And in fact, in the Crock of Gold documentary made by Julian Temple, he pretty much says that at one point, if somebody gave him some heroin, he would take it straight away. He still says that, after everything, that's happened to him and the physical state that he's now in, he still says if someone gave him a load of heroin, he would just immediately take it. And I think, my experience of him is that he is an addict. There is absolutely no question of that. I think initially, when the Pogues came to prominence, he was very much in the. I think Brendan Behan was very much a kind of muse. He had a picture of Brendan Behan on his wall in the flat in Cromer Street, which was just literally a sea of bottles and cigarette ends and all the rest of it. And so definitely he was hugely influenced by him. And I think there is that. I think Victoria possibly may have been quoted in the book as saying, he kind of sees people who can't take their drink. It's not Irish, Right. You've got to be able to hold your drink. So I think there is that kind of at the beginning, old-fashioned view. And I think with Shane, it just became absolutely entrenched as an addiction.
There is this other side of his character, though, that you bring out very well in the book that gets no mention as part of the wild man myth, but just how intelligent and well-read he is. And that's been the case, ever since he was at school, a truly noteworthy English student. How does that sort of manifest itself or did it manifest itself in your dealings and conversations with him?
Whenever you talk to Shane, it's incredible how, even now his memory is astonishing, very, very bright, knows about everything. I remember one night talking about ghost stories or something, which is a big love of mine. He knows all about that. In fact, he knows a lot more about it than I do. You talk about sport, he knows about that. Politics, history, brilliant on history. So you could get a room, you could put a load of academics in a room with him and he would be able to hold his own with them in just the same way as you could stick him in a pub in the middle of Tipperary and he'd hold his own with everyone there. Any company he's comfortable in, I think. And it does. So it manifests itself in just general conversation and his sheer knowledge of history. He's a man of very few words, I should say. So sometimes these interventions are very, very brief. Right. Just when you think that he's asleep, all of a sudden this voice will pop up, and you'll think, and he'll say something very pertinent to the discussion.
Okay, so this is great. So we've got your rules so far are that you shouldn't attempt to interview them. So you spend entire weekends in his company without recording anything. You've then got to this level of you're getting some stories out and you corroborate them elsewhere. You let them have your own voice. Let them have their own voice. But then there's this next stage, which is yet another potential sort of pit lined with sticks that you could step into at any moment. You say, When they do tell you stories and are happily reminiscing, let them speak and don't try and interrupt and ask for details. You say, I learned this the hard way. Please explain.
Yeah, I mean, several times Shane, immediately got angry because he said, I was asking for details. He told me, yes, I'd rather be interviewed by the police. This is what I was told. And it's quite, when he reacts in this way, if you don't know him that well, you would think, God, he's really angry. I mean, it sounds like he's really angry. Actually, he isn't. It's just the way he speaks. His voice goes up quite quickly. And it sounds like he's a lot angrier with you than he actually is. So that's something I kind of learned as a kind of reassurance. But yeah, I mean, I think it was where sometimes it's important to place an incident, a great anecdote somewhere, because you think, well, which school was this at? And that's quite important. Mm-hmm. This is where his anecdotes are not strong on detail. So you're thinking this is a great story for the book, but where did it happen? What age was he? I mean, you're not looking for an exact date because no one cares about that and it doesn't matter. But what does matter is, was he 15 or was he 9? This is quite important, just to place it somewhere. And then he would get very irascible when you're trying to pin down those kind of details. So I kind of learned that maybe it's better to just let him keep going. Don't ask about details. And in some cases, he was probably right, actually. I probably was looking for too much detail. And you can always check those details with other people without running the risk of getting attacked by him.
Right. But I mean, this must go kind of completely against everything you believe as a crime journalist, no? Where your sort of almost sacred obligation is to pin down facts and details and second source everything. You can't go on, print rumors and, half truths and the rest of it. You got to. So did you find yourself having to constantly bite your tongue? Or? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, you're absolutely right. Instinct tells you as a former journalist, that's exactly what you're after. You're taught to kind of, laser in on the facts, especially around crime. With crime particularly, what time did the incident happen is absolutely, critical. Where did it happen? Who saw it? And so on and so forth. These things are vitally important. I've used to cover court cases. Massively important you get it right because, you're covering a legal process. And if you get it wrong, that's a lot of trouble that the newspaper is in and you as well. So, having been taught for 2 decades that you absolutely have to get everything spot on, then interviewing somebody who doesn't give a single, monkeys about when something happened or anything at all, it's yes, you have to bite your tongue and be patient. And Shane is very, very tricky to interview. Julian Temple, who did the documentary, as I've already mentioned, Crock of Gold film. I think it was Shane that actually suggested it. And he thought it'd be a good idea for Julian Temple to do the film. Julian Temple was actually a bit reluctant at first, but eventually said, okay, I'll do it. At which point Shane said, I'm not going to be interviewed. So Julian Temple then had to make a film, effectively not really interviewing Shane at all, and trying to find footage from the past.
Right. Well, there's this fantastic technique that you use to kind of do the same thing. I think at the beginning, there's this long section at the beginning of the book where the family assembles at the sort of ancestral MacGowan home in Tipperary, where it very, very much feels as though you are sitting in on a very sort of intimate family gathering, but you don't really have speaking privileges. But through that you introduce, his childhood, his family relationships, the kind of background that he's from. How did you manage to pull that off?
I think Siobhan MacGowan, his sister, was absolutely instrumental in this book. Without her, I actually couldn't have really done. Well, certainly couldn't have done the book that I eventually produced. It would have been a much less of a book without her. And she very kindly assembled those people together in what is an incredible. I can't stress what an incredible place the Commons is, Carney Commons, which is where Shane went on his childhood sort of pilgrimages over from England. And, he saw this as a kind of idyllic place. He romanticized this place enormously. So she assembled his relatives, many of his relatives who live in Ireland, together there. And again, I mean, it was just a question of listening to them, but also they're not used to being interviewed. I don't think any of those people had really been interviewed before. There were some aunts and some cousins. I've never seen them quoted anywhere before. So I think, again, these are people who are not used to being interviewed. So I think there it was a question of asking them the right questions to try to get them to dredge back things that they might not have thought were important or actually really helpful to illustrate what he was like as a child.
Okay. Now, this fifth rule is very much one of, it feels like a plea for just eternal patience. You say, don't be disappointed if you don't get anything usable, and be prepared to forgo sleep. Go with the flow, as it is more important to get their trust than harangue them for information they don't want to give. I wanted to ask about this. Were you expected to kind of keep up with the drinking as well during all this this process of no sleep? I can imagine it can just be quite exhausting, the whole the process you went through.
Yeah. I mean, it's not expected to keep up with it, but I mean, when you're there, Shane is incredibly generous, I have to say. I mean, if you were out in a bar with him, he would cover everything. That's just normal. He's a very, very generous person, generous with his time, generous with his money, for sure. And whenever you go into the flat, he'll say, "Oh, get yourself a drink." So, it's not that he's sitting there, kind of carefully keeping a bottle to himself, nothing like that. So everyone's there, having a glass with him. But yes, I mean, when it goes on for hours and hours and hours, and you are just sitting there and drinking wine and having a chat with him, it is exhausting. I remember there was one evening when I was about to go to bed, probably needing sleep, I should think, at this point, and this might have been 11 o'clock, quite early. And Shane sort of said, "Oh, can you make me a cup of tea?" So I said, "Yeah, no problem." So I made him a cup of tea, and then I kind of just got the impression, I don't think anyone else was around. I thought, look, this might be an opportunity here. He's not distracted by other people here. So I went and got the tape recorder back out again, having already kind of brushed my teeth and was all ready to go to bed, and thought, I'm going to have to push through for another hour or so.
Right.
Because and I did end up, recording some stuff there. So sometimes, you have to kind of push through the exhaustion, and also just be prepared. I mean, you're never going to interview him in the morning because he's in bed.
Right.
You're talking about someone who won't. I mean, even mid-afternoon, you'd be struggling to get anything out of him. So really, you're talking about the evening and middle of the night are the best times to get anything out of him.
Right.
So,
I mean, you do mention a number of times in the book just how generous he is. That I remember there's a bit where he goes into a pub and the new barmaid is kind of surprised that he doesn't pay for his drinks straight away, because his habit is to pay right at the end with a massive tip. And I think he orders something like a cider, a wine, a cup of coffee and a pint of Guinness for himself, and then asks, what does everybody else want? So he orders this extraordinary sort of cocktail of beverages, and then presumably would quite happily, if somebody else wanted to have 4 drinks for themselves, he would quite happily stand there. But then at the same time, he can be really difficult. Now, so there's this bit where he's so elusive. You mentioned when Johnny Depp is keen to meet him, and he completely gives him the cold shoulder. And so he can switch from being outstanding company to just Arctic in his unwelcomeness.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it makes me. I keep thinking about this when this comes up, and there seems to be something. I think there's been enough incidences of this for there to be something in it. For example, Tom Waits was in New York when the Pogues were playing over there, and there was the opportunity for the Pogues to go out for the evening and spend the evening in Tom Waits' company in a bar. Can you imagine if you're a Waits fan? It's like, dream come true.
Yes.
Shane didn't go. Then Bob Dylan invites the Pogues to play 6 dates across in the West Coast of America. Shane, in my opinion, deliberately gets so wasted. They put him in the hotel at the airport specifically so it would be easier to get him on a plane. Didn't work.
Still didn't make it.
Still didn't make it because he deliberately he sought to sabotage that opportunity by getting so wasted. He knew that they wouldn't let him on the plane, which of course they didn't. He then claimed that he'd tried to get on other flights, but I interviewed his landlady, who said basically he just arrived back at her flat. She opened the door. He fell flat on his face in her hallway, laughing, and then basically spent the next few days saying, "Don't answer the phone, don't answer the door." You know, where obviously people were ringing saying, "Get him on a flight now."
Right.
They couldn't. And I think so. You mentioned the other one there, and I think again, you know, with Johnny Depp, there seems to be this thing with very, very famous people. He doesn't seem to want to sort of engage, which is interesting.
And did you learn anything, Richard, from this experience that has kind of stood you in good stead for taking on future challenges? Or was Shane MacGowan such a one-off that you almost had to kind of craft a bespoke interview method to cope with his approach to life?
Definitely that. I mean, a bespoke process for sure. I mean, I don't think it would be possible to write about somebody with such difficult interviewing conditions. You know, interviewing someone at 3 o'clock in the morning, television blaring, things going on in the room. It may not go into here. Distractions, other people's loud voices, and then someone who doesn't like being interviewed. I mean, right. I don't think you could create a more difficult environment. Like I say, it wasn't hostile as such, but in terms of actually the practicalities of recording in that environment were incredibly difficult. I think maybe one of the things that I've learned from this is probably when I do another book, it will be about somebody who's a lot easier to work with.
I mean, I think anybody who's had to transcribe even 5 minutes of tape in, you know, normal circumstances starts to think, you know, maybe I should consider another profession. But so the idea of hours of tape with blaring television, people talking over the top, it's just, I can't imagine what you went through. It must have reconfigured your brain. And
also another thing we haven't mentioned, which is just yet another component which makes it difficult, is Shane's actually quite hard to understand when he speaks. And you get this constant all the time at the end of everything. So, you know, even when he is talking, sometimes it's quite hard to actually understand what he's telling you.
Wow. Okay, so I'm going to ask you my two general writers questions now. Then, how many words should a writer write each day? What's your output? Your standard day's output?
I would say probably a minimum of about 1,000. I think would be I mean, this book was probably something like 130,000 words.
Right.
So I think anything less than that, and it's going to take you a long time.
Okay. My other question is, I found one of the few things that writers tend to have in common is that virtually none of them actually like writing. Where do you stand on that?
Maybe because of Shane and the difficulties of recording the interviews, maybe the writing seemed like a little bit more enjoyable in this, because it was something that I actually had control over.
Right. And has it put you off writing biographies for good?
No, not at all. I think, I'm very happy in the end I've been very happy in the end with what I produced here. I'm not somebody that generally likes anything that I do. I always think I'm always looking at the negative, always looking at it, thinking it could have been better if. I wish I had done this. Wish I'd spoken to that person. So I'm always a bit glass half empty. But actually, in this instance, I think given the difficulties of getting information from Shane, as we've talked about, I think what I produced in the end, what I did manage to get from him was pretty good, actually, in a lot of instances. And also, I was really happy with the other people that I spoke to, especially people like his his teacher, who's since passed away, who was about 90 years old when I went to see him, and who had kept all of Shane's school books and essays and stuff. Obviously,
Right.
he couldn't possibly have known that Shane would become famous, and yet he'd kept these and hadn't kept them from any other students. So I think, I do feel that the hard work paid off.
And has word filtered back from the MacGowan clan as to whether he likes it or not?
I would be pretty confident that he hasn't read it. I don't think Victoria or Shane have read it. If they have, I haven't been told that. I would imagine that he probably doesn't like it very much. He doesn't really like being written about, as we've already discussed. Doesn't like being interviewed. It wasn't something that he wanted, although he wasn't against the idea. So I would. I haven't really heard anything specifically, but I would imagine that he probably wouldn't like it.
Brilliant. Well, Richard, it's a whether he likes it or not, it's a phenomenal book about a truly extraordinary subject. I think you've done a tremendous job, and I urge everybody to read it immediately. Well done. And thank you for talking to me today.
Thanks so much.
From Strong Words magazine, these are the 5 rules of writing.